True strength doesn't always need to be loud or brash. Sometimes it's quiet. It doesn't come through shouts or dramatic displays, but through the ability to hold your peace when everything around you demands a reaction. Silence is a force misunderstood by many. While the world glorifies those who argue the loudest and push the hardest, real strength is found in the discipline of stillness. Silence is not a sign of weakness, it's a strategy, a weapon that cuts deeper than words ever could. When you choose silence, you shift the focus. It's no longer about their antics, their arrogance, or their need to prove a point. Suddenly, the stage they were performing on feels empty, and the spotlight they were basking in dims. Her silence forces them to deal with themselves, and for an ego that thrives on validation, nothing is more destructive. There's something powerful about not giving people what they expect. The ego thrives on noise. It craves your reactions, your defenses, and your rebuttals. When someone is fueled by their ego, they often aim to provoke, to pull you into their chaos so they can feel bigger, stronger, and more in control. But when you choose to withhold your response, it creates a void they can't fill on their own. That void doesn't just irritate them, it exposes them. The silence you maintain becomes a mirror they have to face, reflecting their own insecurities and their need for constant affirmation. It's in this quiet confrontation that the ego begins to crumble. People often misunderstand the power of silence because it's intangible. It doesn't shout back or wave a banner, yet its impact is undeniable. Have you ever seen someone lose their composure simply because they couldn't get a rise out of you? That's the power of silence. It dismantles their control. It shifts the dynamic, and most importantly, it reminds them and you of where the real strength lies. When you refuse to engage, you are saying without words, I am not your puppet, and you cannot pull my strings. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. That's recognizing that your energy is too valuable to waste on meaningless arguments and petty disputes. Choosing silence doesn't mean you're ignoring the situation. It doesn't mean you're blind to the arrogance or disrespect coming your way. It means you've made a deliberate decision not to empower it. There's a discipline required to stay silent when everything inside you wants to respond. It takes maturity to step back and let your silence do the talking. It's not about avoiding conflict, but about choosing battles worth fighting. And sometimes the battle is best fought by saying nothing at all. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them grapple with the absence of your reaction. In that space, they are left alone with their ego. And without the fuel of your response, it begins to starve. You see, the ego is fragile. It puts on a show of confidence and strength, but underneath it's built on shaky ground. The ego relies on external validation to survive. It needs applause, attention, and a sense of superiority. When you stop feeding that need, the ego falters. It begins to crack under the weight of its own insecurity. Your silence becomes the very thing that forces it to confront the truth it's been trying to hide. The truth that their power isn't real, their confidence isn't solid, and their need to control you is a reflection of their lack of control over themselves. Silence doesn't mean you're defeated. In fact, silence is often the loudest response you can give. It says more than words ever could. It speaks of your strength, your discernment, and your ability to rise above. It shows that you're not afraid to let them talk, boast, or throw their weight around because you know who you are. You're secure enough in yourself not to be rattled by their attempts to provoke you. And that kind of confidence is unsettling to someone whose ego is built on the need for constant engagement. When they realize they can't shake you, they start to question themselves. And let me tell you something about silence. It has a way of inviting clarity. When you're quiet, you can hear what's really happening beneath the surface. You're no longer distracted by the noise of the moment, and you begin to see things for what they truly are. Your silence doesn't just destroy the ego, it strengthens your spirit. It gives you the space to reflect, to pray, to regroup, and to rise above. While they're busy trying to pull you down, your silence is lifting you to higher ground. Silence is not passive, it's intentional. It's the decision to let go of what doesn't serve you and to trust that the truth will reveal itself in time. And when the truth does come out, it's louder than any argument could ever be. The silence you choose today isn't just about avoiding conflict, it's about building character. It's about stepping into a place of wisdom and strength where you're no longer swayed by the antics of others. You're no longer a prisoner to their need for attention. So the next time someone's ego demands your reaction, remember this: you hold the power, not them. Your silence is a declaration that you are in control of yourself, and that alone is enough to dismantle their ego. Silence is not the absence of action, it is the presence of power. It's a quiet storm that shakes their foundation while keeping yours intact. Let your silence speak for you, and trust that its impact will reach far beyond what words could ever achieve. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the one you don't make. Ego thrives in the noise. It craves validation, applause, and the constant sound of its own voice echoing back. It seeks the spotlight, the argument, the attention, and when it doesn't get what it wants, it starts to crumble. Growth, however, happens in the quiet. Growth doesn't need an audience or a stage. It takes place in those moments of stillness when no one is watching, no one is clapping, and no one is there to fuel the fire of the ego. The truth is, the ego can't survive in silence because it can't handle the lack of noise. Silence is like oxygen to the soul, but poison to the ego. When all the noise fades away, what's left is the truth. And for an ego, the truth is often too much to bear. The ego feeds on noise because it's built on insecurity. It's a fragile thing, no matter how loud or confident it may appear. The louder it gets, the more fragile it is, hiding behind a wall of sound to mask its vulnerability. When you remove the noise, the ego is left naked, exposed for what it really is: an overcompensation, a defense mechanism, a shield built out of fear. Silence forces the ego to confront itself, and that's why it's so powerful. The ego doesn't want to grow, it wants to dominate, but silence doesn't allow for domination. Silence creates space, and in that space, growth begins. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable people become when the room goes silent? They start fidgeting, looking for something to say or do to fill the void. That discomfort isn't just about the silence itself, it's about what the silence reveals. Noise can hide a lot. It can distract, deflect, and distort, but silence brings clarity. When the noise is gone, you can see things as they really are, not as they've been spun or manipulated to appear. The ego doesn't like that kind of clarity because it thrives in confusion and distraction. It thrives in chaos because chaos keeps it in control. But growth, true, meaningful growth, requires clarity. It requires a willingness to sit in the quiet and face whatever comes up. Growth happens when you stop feeding the ego and start listening to the deeper parts of yourself, the parts that aren't concerned with validation or applause, the parts that know who you are, regardless of who's watching or what they're saying. When you embrace silence, you give yourself permission to let go of the need to prove anything. You realize that your worth isn't tied to how many people agree with you, how many arguments you win, or how many times you're praised. Your worth is inherent, and silence allows you to reconnect with that truth. But silence isn't just about personal growth. It also forces the people around you to reckon with their own egos. When someone's ego is loud and overbearing, it's tempting to match their volume, to fight fire with fire. But that only feeds the ego on both sides. It keeps the cycle of noise going and no one wins. Silence, on the other hand, disrupts the cycle. It doesn't give the ego what it wants, and in doing so, it exposes just how fragile and dependent it really is. When you refuse to engage with someone's ego, you take away its power. You create a space where their noise starts to echo back to them. And in that echo, they are forced to confront themselves. This isn't easy. Silence can feel like surrender when every part of you wants to speak up, defend yourself, or fight back. But silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. It's the recognition that not every battle is worth fighting, especially when the fight is only about feeding someone's ego. By choosing silence, you're not ignoring the situation, you're rising above it. You're stepping into a place of strength and wisdom that doesn't need noise to prove its power. You're showing that real growth comes from restraint, not from retaliation. Silence is also where you find perspective. When you step back from the noise, you can see the bigger picture. You can see what's really at stake, what really matters, and what's worth your time and energy. The ego doesn't want you to have that perspective because perspective leads to growth, and growth means the ego has to shrink. But in the silence, you find clarity. You find the truth, and the truth is what sets you free. The beauty of silence is that it doesn't just transform you, it transforms the situation. When you choose silence, you're not just taking away the power of the ego, you're creating a space for something new to emerge. A space for understanding, for healing, for growth. Silence is a reset button. It's a pause that allows everyone involved to step back, reflect, and recalibrate. It's in that pause that real change can happen, both within you and around you. The world glorifies noise, but the greatest transformations happen in the quiet. Think about as seeds grow in the darkness of the soil, not under the glare of the sun. Babies grow in the silence of the womb, not in the noise of the world. The most profound moments of growth in your life likely didn't happen in the spotlight, but in the stillness when you were alone with your thoughts, your fears, and your dreams. That's where growth happens. That's where you find yourself free from the noise of the ego and the expectations of others. So when the noise of the world gets loud and the egos around you demand your attention, remember this: you don't have to engage. You don't have to add to the chaos. You can choose silence. And in that silence, you'll find strength, clarity, and the space to grow into the person you were always meant to be. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is to say nothing at all. Not every battle requires your voice or voice, and not every situation deserves your energy. There's a unique power in choosing not to react when the world expects you to. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. The ego thrives on engagement, drawing strength from your response, your argument, your defense. But when you choose to remain still, when you refuse to respond, you rob the ego of its fuel. Non-reaction isn't a sign that you're indifferent or that you don't care. It's a demonstration that you've risen above the chaos. It's proof that your identity, your worth, and your peace aren't tied to anyone else's need for control or validation. The truth is, not everything that comes your way deserves a response. People driven by ego often aim to provoke. Their words are like bait, their actions carefully designed to pull you into their storm. But here's the thing about storms: they're temporary. They're loud, chaotic, and destructive, but they always pass. Your non-reaction becomes the calm in the center of that storm. It doesn't mean you're passive. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've chosen to anchor yourself in a deeper strength, one that doesn't waver in the face of provocation. When you choose not to react, you shift the power dynamic. You take control of the narrative without uttering a single word. You show that you're not a puppet on someone else's string, that your emotions and actions aren't dictated by their ego or their agenda. This doesn't just frustrate them, it forces them to confront their own behavior. They may not admit it, but your silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. It says, I'm not playing your game. I'm not giving you the satisfaction of controlling me. That kind of self-restraint is unsettling to someone who thrives on conflict because it leaves them with no choice but to deal with themselves. Non-reaction isn't about avoiding the issue, it's about addressing it in a way that protects your peace and preserves your energy. There are battles worth fighting, and there are battles best left alone. Wisdom is knowing the difference. The ego wants to drag you into every fight because it feeds on attention. But when you step back and refuse to engage, you say, my peace is more valuable than your drama. My growth is more important than your need to win. That's not just self-preservation, it's self-respect. But let's be honest, staying silent when provoked isn't easy. Everything in you may want to respond, to set the record straight, to defend your honor. That's the ego talking. It wants to be right. It wants to be right. But real power comes from restraint. It comes from knowing that your value isn't tied to how well you argue or how loudly you speak. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to let go of the need to prove yourself, to let go of the need to be understood, to be vindicated, to be seen as right. In choosing not to react, you create space for reflection, space for understanding, and most importantly, space for growth. Silence doesn't mean you're ignoring the situation. It means you're stepping back to see it clearly. It means you're choosing to respond, not with your words, but with your actions, your character, and your integrity. And make no mistake, that response is far more powerful than any argument ever could be. When you refuse to react, you're not just protecting yourself, you're teaching others how to treat you. You're setting a standard. You're saying, I'm not going to lower myself to this level. If you want to engage with me, it has to be from a place of respect and understanding. That's not just strength, that's leadership. And it's a kind of leadership that inspires change, not just in you, but in the people around you. Think about it. When was the last time an argument truly resolved anything? When was the last time reacting in anger or frustration brought about real, lasting change? Most of the time, arguments only serve to escalate the situation. They feed the fire instead of putting it out. Non-reaction, on the other hand, is like water to that fire. It cools things down. It creates room for reason, for clarity, for perspective. And in that space, solutions can emerge. Understanding can emerge. Healing can emerge. This isn't about letting people walk all over you. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. It's about recognizing that not every attack requires a counterattack. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stand still, to let the storm rage around you while you remain unmoved. That kind of strength doesn't just protect your peace, it transforms the situation. It takes the power away from the ego and places it firmly in your hands. Choosing non-reaction is an act of faith. It's saying, I trust that the truth will reveal itself in time. I trust that my silence will speak louder than my words. I trust that my character will shine through, even if I don't defend myself. That kind of faith isn't easy, but it's worth it. Because in the end, it's not about proving yourself to others. It's about proving to yourself that you are strong enough, wise enough, and secure enough to rise above. So when the world provokes you, when the ego demands your reaction, remember this, you have nothing to prove. Your silence is your strength. Your restraint is your power. And sometimes the loudest message you can send is the one you never say. Silence is not absence, it's presence. It's choosing to respond not with your voice, but with your peace, your wisdom, and your unwavering sense of self. There comes a time when you realize that your words are no longer needed. You've said enough, explained enough, and tried enough. It's in these moments that silence becomes an act of surrender, not to the situation, but to something greater than yourself. When you step back and choose silence, you're making room for God to work. Your silence isn't a sign of defeat. It's a declaration of trust. It's saying, I don't have to fight this battle because I know who's really in control. There's a power in letting go of the need to have the last word and allowing God's voice to be the one that speaks the loudest. You see, the ego doesn't want you to rely on silence because silence requires faith. The ego wants you to take matters into your own hands, to prove yourself, to fix it, to fight it. But there's something profound that happens when you resist that urge and allow your silence to create space for divine intervention. Silence is where God operates. It's where he moves in ways that you could never anticipate. When you stop speaking, you allow his truth to echo louder than anything you could say. And his truth has a way of settling matters in ways that human words and actions never could. The ego loves noise because it keeps us distracted. It keeps us busy trying to solve things, to explain things, to justify things. But noise drowns out the still, small voice of God. When you choose silence, you're tuning out the chaos and tuning into his frequency. It's in the quiet that you hear his guidance, his reassurance, and his plan. It's in the quiet that you realize the battle was never yours to fight in the first place. You may think that silence leaves room for your opponents to gain ground, but in reality, it's the opposite. Your silence allows God to step in and do what only he can do. There's a story in every silence, a lesson in every pause. When you choose to be silent, you're allowing the situation to unfold without interference. You're allowing truth to rise to the surface. Silence doesn't mean you're ignoring the problem. It means you're giving it over to a higher power. It means you're saying, God, I've done all I can. Now it's your turn, and when you do that, you'll often find that his solutions are far greater than anything you could have imagined. The ego wants control. It wants to dictate the outcome and orchestrate every detail, but control is an illusion. The harder you try to hold on to it, the more it slips through your fingers. Silence, on the other hand, is an act of release. It's acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, but you know the one who does. It's choosing to trust that even when you can't see the way forward, there's a plan unfolding behind the scenes. That kind of trust isn't easy, especially when everything in you wants to speak up, to act, to do something. But silence is often the greatest demonstration of faith. When you choose silence, you're not just stepping back, you're stepping aside. You're making room for God to work in ways that go beyond human understanding. And when he moves, he doesn't just settle the surface issues, he gets to the root. He doesn't just change the situation, he transforms hearts. Your silence becomes an invitation for him to step in and do what you cannot. It's not about abandoning the situation, it's about elevating it to a level where real, lasting change can happen. But silence isn't just about waiting on God, it's also about witnessing his power. When you stop speaking, you start seeing, you start noticing the ways he's moving, the ways he's aligning things, and the ways he's preparing you for what's next. Silence is a posture of expectancy. It's saying, I know you're working even if I can't see it yet. And when you take that posture, you'll find that your silence becomes a testimony. It becomes evidence of your faith and a reflection of his glory. Sometimes the most profound shifts happen when you stop trying to force them. Your silence creates a space for transformation, not just in the situation, but in you. It humbles you, it refines you, and it strengthens your faith. It reminds you that you're not in control. And that's okay, because the one who is in control sees what you can't see, knows what you don't know, and works in ways that you could never comprehend. Silence also teaches you patience. It's easy to want immediate results, to want things resolved right here and now. But God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with yours. Choosing silence means trusting that his plan is worth the wait. It means believing that the outcome he's orchestrating is better than anything you could have forced through your own efforts. When you let silence take its place, you're not just changing the dynamic of the situation, you're shifting the spiritual atmosphere. You're reminding yourself and everyone around you that there's a greater power at work. You're declaring that you don't need to rely on your own strength because his strength is more than enough. And in that declaration, there's freedom. Freedom from the pressure to perform, to defend, to fix. Freedom to rest in the assurance that he's got it covered. So when the world expects you to shout, when the ego demands that you speak, and when everything around you says you need to act, remember this, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be still. Let your silence be your prayer. Let it be your trust. Let it be the space where God's voice is heard, his presence is felt, and his power is revealed. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of faith.